How do you reconcile your belief in the slaughter of innocents is always wrong? Looking back to your God slaughtered innocents in the Old Testament, the flood. He wiped out many children in the flood. Sodom and Gomorrah, presumably many children died there as well. Shouldn't that also be absolutely wrong?
Actually, that makes sense.
Okay, difficult question. You're right. When God judged at that time of Noah, undoubtedly innocent children perished. No question about that. So is that not immoral of God? According to America, the worst thing that can happen to a person is that they die. That is not the biblical perspective. The worst thing that can happen to me is not that I die, but rather that I die and go into a godless eternity. Second point. In America, we thrive on individualism. I live my life, you live your life. No real impact on each other. You just do your thing and I do my thing. The Bible insists we're more interconnected than we would like to admit. Children of alcoholics, children of divorce, really bear some scars, don't they? So the decisions that I make, if I am naive enough to think it's just going to affect my life, I am naive. We are interconnected, more interconnected than we would like to admit as American individualists. Third point. Yes, God did choose to judge certain cultures, certain groups of people for their immorality, for their evil. And in that judgment, as he judged a group of people, there were innocent people who were swept along in that judgment. That happened at the time of Noah. It also happened when God used, first of all, the Assyrians, and then secondly, the Babylonians to judge the Jewish people. It's not that all Jewish people were evil. Certainly some innocent children were swept along in that judgment. So yes, God has chosen to judge people groups, and when he judged a nation, a culture, there were innocent people who were swept along in that judgment. No question about that. How have I not answered your question?
You've answered it. I'm just not as comfortable with that as you are.
Okay, why are you not comfortable with that?
An omniscient, omnipotent God really ought to be able to come up with a better solution. So the whole universe plays according to God's rules. Couldn't he have done better than that?
Okay, great point. If the whole universe plays according to God's rules, couldn't he come up with a better way of doing it? When we say that God is omnipotent, we do not mean that God makes 2 + 2 = 5. When we say that God is omnipotent, what we mean is that God is all-powerful to do that which is meaningful, reasonable, not irrational and crazy. Now, I think it's rather clear that the omnipotent God chose to partially limit his power by creating us with a free will. If I haul back, slap her in the face, turn to you and say, the omnipotent God made me do it, I'm a con artist. God gave me a will and a hand. If I choose to use this hand to smack her pretty face and then blame God, I'm copping out. God cannot give us free will and then program what we do. When he chooses to limit his power and create us free, when he respects our freedom, he allows us to do what we choose to do. And so when human beings in a nation heap evil up to a very high level, and God chooses to judge that nation, are there innocent people swept along in that judgment? Yes, there are. And God does not necessarily miraculously intervene and pluck all those innocent children out of that situation, because they are tied to their parents, tied to their culture. They experience the judgment. And that is no different from you making an irresponsible decision and your children having to bear the consequences of that irresponsible decision. That is the type of world you and I live in. We are free to make decisions, but there are consequences to our decisions. And part of growing up means we begin to realize there are real consequences to our decisions.
The instances in the Old Testament where God commanded the destruction of a people or a place often bring up challenging questions. It's important to realize that these actions were not random or without cause. God's commands were always rooted in a larger context of justice, mercy, and his overarching plan for humanity's redemption. Throughout the Bible, we see that God is patient and slow to anger. For example, in Genesis 15:16, God tells Abraham that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete, indicating that he gave them hundreds of years to change their ways before bringing judgment upon them. This shows that God's actions weren't impulsive. They were a last resort after long periods of warning and chances for repentance. When God did instruct the Israelites to act against other nations, it was often because those nations had become utterly corrupt, engaging in practices like child sacrifice, extreme violence, and idolatry. These practices not only harmed their own people, but also threatened the moral fabric of surrounding nations. The Canaanites, for example, were deeply entrenched in such practices, and their destruction was seen as a way to remove evil and protect future generations from being influenced by such corruption. Paul Copan, in his book, Is God a Vindictive Bully?, explains that these difficult passages must be viewed within the context of God's ultimate plan for justice and mercy. God's commands were part of a divine strategy to maintain moral order and to prepare the way for the coming of Christ, who would offer salvation to all. It's also important to recognize that God's judgments, though severe, were not without mercy. Even in the midst of judgment, there were opportunities for repentance and redemption, as seen with Rahab in Jericho, Joshua 2. This shows that God's intent wasn't to destroy, but to lead people to repentance. The instances of destruction commanded by God in the Old Testament were not the actions of a capricious deity, but measured responses to human depravity, aimed at upholding justice and paving the way for ultimate redemption through Jesus Christ. These stories remind us of the seriousness of sin, the holiness of God, and his unwavering commitment to justice and mercy.